So today I want to take you inside a moment that the world saw, but almost no one truly understood. On April 7th at the United Nations Security Council, something happened that looked simple on the surface, but beneath it, it revealed the entire power structure of this war. China and Russia used their veto power on a resolution related to the Strait of Hormuz, and within minutes, headlines across Western media painted a familiar picture. China backs Iran. Russia and China protect a destabilizing regime. They're risking the global economy. But what if I told you that this narrative is not just incomplete, it's fundamentally misleading? Because here's the question no one is asking, and I want you to really think about this before we go any further. China is the world's largest buyer of Iranian oil. A massive portion of that oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. If that route is disrupted, China is one of the biggest losers on the planet. So then, why? Why would China block a resolution that on paper aims to reopen that very route? Why would the country with the most to lose from a blockade be the one stopping the so-called solution? This is where things get interesting because the moment you answer that question, the entire chessboard flips. This is no longer about good guys versus bad guys or supporting Iran versus opposing the West. This is about strategy at the highest level, about power, leverage, and long-term control. And once you see it clearly, you'll realize something shocking. China's veto was not a defensive move. It wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. In fact, it may have been the smartest move in this entire conflict, one that quietly shifts the balance of power in ways most people haven't even begun to notice. All right, now, let's slow this down and really unpack what actually happened, because the details here are everything, and most people completely miss them. On April the 7th, 2026, inside the United Nations Security Council, a resolution was put to vote, originally proposed by Bahrain. On paper, it sounded straightforward: restore freedom of transit through the Strait of Hormuz. But hidden inside that resolution was a very powerful phrase: all necessary means. And in diplomatic language, that's not just wording, that's permission. Permission for military action, permission for escalation, permission for war under international legitimacy. Now, here's what happened next. 11 countries voted in favor. China and Russia vetoed it. Pakistan and Colombia abstained. And immediately the narrative was locked in. China and Russia are protecting Iran. Simple, clean, easy to understand, but completely shallow. Because what most people don't realize is what happened before that final vote. The original draft of the resolution was extremely aggressive. It would have effectively allowed any nation to use military force to reopen the strait. And that's a massive step. That's not diplomacy, that's escalation with legal cover. And multiple countries, including China, Russia, and even France, pushed back hard. They said this goes too far. So the resolution was revised. The language authorizing offensive force was removed. It became softer, more neutral, more acceptable. And yet China and Russia still vetoed it. Then it was revised again. This time they stripped out even more authority. They removed references that tied it directly to Security Council enforcement. At this point, the resolution had been diluted significantly. It was no longer the same aggressive document it started as. And still, China and Russia said no, not once, not twice, every single time. Now, listen carefully to how this was framed. The U.S. ambassador said China and Russia sided with the regime trying to intimidate the Gulf. The UK ambassador claimed they chose to shield their ally, and that became the dominant story: China and Russia protecting Iran. But here's the real question. Are we looking at what happened, or are we just accepting the easiest explanation? Because if you zoom out and apply a more serious geopolitical lens, the picture starts to change completely. There's a simple framework I always come back to. Don't focus on what countries say, focus on what their actions actually achieve. Ask one question: who benefits? So let's apply that to China. China imports roughly 10 to 11 million barrels of oil every single day, and a huge portion of that supply flows through the Strait of Hormuz. On the surface, that means China should desperately want that route open. It should be pushing harder than anyone for stability, right? Because in the short term, a blockade hurts China a lot. But here's where most people stop thinking, and where the real insight begins. China's not playing a short-term game. It never has. While other countries react to immediate pressure, China calculates decades ahead. So, yes, in the short term, this disruption creates pain, but in the long term, the dynamics it creates, the shifts in power, the dependencies it exposes, the leverage it builds, those are far more valuable. And when you look at it from that perspective, the veto stops looking like a contradiction and starts looking like strategy. In fact, when you connect all the dots, this wasn't hesitation. This wasn't about protecting anyone. This was a calculated move designed to reshape the board itself. And once you truly understand that, you realize something very few people are saying out loud. This veto wasn't just justified, it may have been one of the most strategically brilliant decisions China has made in years. Let me explain why this veto is so powerful. And I want you to follow this carefully because each layer builds on the last. And by the end of it, the entire strategy becomes crystal clear. Start with the first principle. What this resolution would have actually done in the real world, even in its softened, watered down form, it would have given the United States and its allies something incredibly valuable, not just permission, but legitimacy. It would have been the United Nations Security Council effectively saying, yes, you have the right to use force in and around the Strait of Hormuz. You have the authority to secure it. And that changes everything. Because once military action is backed by international legitimacy, it's no longer just power, it's power with approval. Now, think about what that means strategically for China. If the United States steps in, reopens the strait by force, and pushes Iran into submission, it sends a very clear signal to the entire world. America still controls the most critical energy choke points on the planet. It proves that even in a so-called era of decline, the US can still decide who gets access to energy and who doesn't. And if that becomes the reality, then China is right back where it has always feared being, dependent. Dependent on American-controlled sea lanes, dependent on a system where at any moment its oil supply could be threatened. In Chinese strategic thinking, this fear has a name: the Malacca Dilemma. The idea that the US Navy can choke China's economy by controlling key maritime routes. Now imagine that same vulnerability extending to Hormuz. That's not just a risk, that's a strategic nightmare for Beijing. So from this perspective, the first conclusion is simple. If America wins here, China loses. And if China understands that, then blocking the resolution isn't optional, it's necessary. But now let's move to the second layer because this is where it becomes truly fascinating. What happens if the strait doesn't reopen? What happens if the disruption continues? On the surface, yes, it hurts China. Energy prices rise, supply chains tighten, uncertainty increases. But beneath that short-term pain, something much bigger is happening. Something China has been quietly working toward for decades is being accelerated because the closure of the Strait of Hormuz doesn't just disrupt oil flows, it disrupts the entire financial system built around those flows. To understand this, you have to understand the petrodollar system. Since the 1970s, global oil trade has been dominated by the US dollar, largely due to an agreement between United States and Saudi Arabia. Oil is sold in dollars, which means every country in the world needs dollars to buy energy, and that creates constant global demand for the dollar, allowing the US to finance massive deficits, sustain its financial markets, and maintain its global influence. In simple terms, the dollar isn't just a currency, it's the backbone of American power. Now, here's where the disruption changes everything. If the Strait of Hormuz remains unstable or partially closed, Gulf states struggle to export oil efficiently. The flow of petrodollars begins to weaken. Those dollars stop cycling back into American assets, into stock markets, into tech investments, into the very systems that reinforce US dominance. And as that system starts to feel pressure, countries around the world begin asking a very dangerous question: what if we don't need the dollar anymore? And this is exactly where China's long-term strategy comes into play. Because for years, China has been building alternatives. UN-based oil trading mechanisms, cross-border payment systems tied to the Belt and Road Initiative, and deeper energy integration with countries like Russia and Iran. These systems don't matter much in a stable, dollar-dominated world. But in a world under stress, a world where traditional systems are cracking, they suddenly become extremely attractive. So, what looks like a crisis on the surface is, in reality, an opportunity underneath. Every week that the Hormuz situation remains unresolved, the pressure on the dollar based system increases. Every disruption pushes more countries to experiment with alternatives, and every alternative that gains traction slowly shifts power away from Washington and toward Beijing. And this is the key insight most people miss. China is willing to absorb short term pain in exchange for long term transformation. Because if this trend continues, it doesn't just weaken American influence, it fundamentally reshapes the global economic order. And in that new order, China isn't reacting to the system anymore, it's helping define it. Now, let's move to the third layer of this strategy because this is where most people completely underestimate China. A lot of people look at the situation and say, okay, but if the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted, doesn't that mean China is running out of oil? Doesn't that mean China is hurting itself? And on the surface, that sounds logical. But it only sounds logical if you assume China is reacting in real time. In reality, China has been preparing for exactly this kind of disruption for years, quietly, systematically, and at scale. Think about how China approaches supply chains. It doesn't just optimize for efficiency, it designs for resilience. Over the past decade, China has been building massive strategic petroleum reserves, essentially stockpiling energy for moments like this. It has been diversifying its suppliers so it's not overly dependent on any single region. It has invested heavily in infrastructure projects like the China Pakistan Economic Corridor, which gives it access to the Arabian Sea without relying entirely on traditional choke points. At the same time, it has been working with Russia and Iran on overland energy routes, such as the International North South Transport Corridor, reducing its dependence on vulnerable maritime lanes. And perhaps most importantly, China has been aggressively building its domestic energy capacity, solar, wind, and nuclear on a scale the world has never seen. This isn't just about climate policy, it's about strategic independence. It's about ensuring that when disruptions happen, China doesn't collapse under pressure, it adapts. So, yes, the blockade creates short term pain, but here's the key difference China has planned for that pain. It has buffers, it has alternatives, it has redundancy built into its system. And when you compare that to other major economies, the United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, many of them are far more exposed to sudden energy shocks. They are more dependent on stable maritime flows. They have fewer immediate alternatives. So, what looks like a global crisis is actually a stress test. And in that stress test, China is one of the best prepared players on the board. Every week this situation drags on, the systems China has built become more valuable, and the American controlled maritime order becomes slightly less dominant. Now, let's go one level deeper, because this is the part almost no one talks about, the legal and moral dimension of the veto. Inside the United Nations Security Council, China's ambassador, Fu Kong, made a critical point. The resolution did not address the root causes of the conflict. Russia's representative echoed the same idea that the proposal placed blame on Iran while ignoring the actions that triggered the escalation in the first place. And whether you agree with that framing or not, the argument itself matters. Because think about the sequence of events being debated. Military strikes are carried out against Iran, a sovereign state. Its facilities are targeted, its leadership is hit. And then, after that escalation, a resolution is introduced asking for international authorization to use force against that same country because it is now responding. Step back and look at the logic of that. From the perspective of many countries outside the Western alliance, this doesn't look like maintaining order. It looks like setting a precedent. And this is where the global perception shifts. Across parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the so-called global south, there has been a growing skepticism toward how international rules are applied. Many countries have watched similar patterns for decades: intervention first, justification later. So when China vetoes a resolution like this, it's not just making a geopolitical move, it's sending a signal that it will not automatically endorse the use of force under these circumstances, a signal that international law should not be selectively applied. And that creates something incredibly valuable for China: narrative power. Because suddenly, China is no longer just a rising economic power. It is positioning itself as a defender of sovereignty and a critic of selective enforcement in the global system. Meanwhile, the United States, which often frames itself as the guardian of a rules-based order, finds itself being portrayed, at least in some parts of the world, as a country that bends those rules when it suits its interests. And in geopolitics, perception is power, because wars are not just fought with weapons, they're fought with narratives. And in this moment, China's veto didn't just block a resolution, it reshaped how the entire situation is being interpreted by much of the world. Now, let's step back and look at the biggest layer of all, because this veto is not just about a waterway or even about a war. It's about the kind of world we are moving into. For years, I've argued that we are transitioning from a unipolar system where the United States dominates and sets the rules to a multipolar system where power is distributed across multiple nations and no single country can impose its will without resistance. And what happened on April 7th inside the United Nations Security Council was one of the clearest signals yet that this transition is no longer theoretical. It's happening in real time. Because what China and Russia effectively demonstrated with that veto is something very simple but very powerful. The Security Council is not America's rubber stamp anymore. For decades after the Cold War, the US operated with a level of global freedom that no empire in history had ever enjoyed. If it wanted to intervene somewhere, it could. If it wanted to sanction, isolate, or pressure a country, it could. And if it needed international legitimacy, it could often secure it because Russia was weakened and China had not yet risen to challenge that system in a meaningful way. But that era is now over, and the Hormuz veto makes that painfully clear. Because here you have a situation where the US goes to the UN seeking authorization for something it frames as essential, keeping a critical global choke point open, and it fails. Not because of technicalities, not because of procedural delays, but because two major powers looked at the proposal and said, no, we are not going to allow this. That is a structural shift in how global power operates. It means there are now real limits, visible, enforceable limits on what America can do through international institutions. And most people are missing this because they're focused only on missiles, ships, and troop movements. But wars are not decided only on the battlefield. They are fought across systems, military, economic, political, and narrative. And if you really want to understand who is winning, you have to look at all four at the same time. So let's tie everything together with that framework. Imagine you're not an observer, but an investor, a strategist looking at this conflict and asking one question: who is gaining power across all dimensions? Militarily, China hasn't fired a single shot. It hasn't deployed troops. It hasn't spent billions on weapons. And yet, with a single veto, it has blocked the United States from obtaining international legal cover for military action. That's an extraordinary outcome, shaping the battlefield without ever stepping onto it. Economically, the impact is just as significant. By preventing a quick resolution, the veto keeps pressure on global energy flows and, more importantly, on the dollar-based system tied to those flows. The petrodollar system remains under stress, and every moment of instability pushes countries to consider alternatives, many of which China has already been building. At the same time, China's own preparations, its reserves, diversified supply chains, and domestic energy expansion allow it to absorb the shock better than many of its rivals. Politically, the move is even more powerful. China positions itself not as an aggressor, but as a defender of sovereignty and international law. In a world where a large portion of countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America have long been skeptical of Western interventions, this positioning resonates deeply. It builds trust, it builds alignment, and it strengthens China's influence in regions that will define the future global order. And then there's the narrative dimension, the most underestimated battlefield of all. Right now, China is telling a story that is incredibly compelling to much of the world. We are not the ones escalating conflict. We are not the ones initiating strikes. We are the ones saying that rules should apply equally to everyone. Meanwhile, the US, fairly or unfairly, is being framed in some parts of the world as a country that acts first and seeks justification later. And in geopolitics, perception shapes reality more than most people realize. So when you look at all four dimensions together, military, economic, political, and narrative, you start to see the full picture. This wasn't just a veto, it was a multi-layered strategic move that advanced China's position across the board while costing it almost nothing in direct confrontation. No war, no escalation, no massive expenditure, just leverage, timing, and precision. And that is what makes it so significant, because the world we are moving into doesn't reward raw force the way it once did. Power today is not defined only by armies, fleets, or firepower. It's defined by something far more subtle, far more effective: the ability to shape outcomes without ever pulling the trigger. And in that environment, the rules change completely. The strongest player isn't the one who reacts the fastest or strikes the hardest. It's the one who positions itself so precisely that others are forced to react to it. The one who can influence the board without visibly moving a single piece. And that's exactly what we just witnessed. With one decision, no missiles, no deployments, no escalation, China didn't just respond to the situation, it quietly redefined it. It limited its rivals' options, altered the trajectory of the conflict, and shifted the strategic balance, all without entering the battlefield.